Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Artist Talk for Christina Leslie's exhibition, The Album. My name is Leila Timmins, and I am the Senior Curator at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery, and I have the absolute pleasure of being in conversation with Christina today. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at her exhibition, I would welcome you to visit it through our website. It's a beautiful body of work. And also to let everyone know that it isn't physically up yet because of pandemic problems, but we will be featuring one of the works from this series as a light box on the front of our building soon over the summer. So we'll update everyone as that is when it manifests, hopefully soon. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Robert McLaughlin Gallery is located on the ancestral and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island and the traditional territory of the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe. For me, a territorial acknowledgement is an important reminder that Canada is a settler nation built on and resourced through extraction of Indigenous lands. And as an uninvited guest on this territory, I am grateful for the opportunity to meet here today with all of you and for the generations of people who've taken care of this land since time immemorial. We know that the work of acknowledging territory and seeking justice for colonial harm lives with us here in the present and will continue into the future. I will also be talking a bit about colonial histories today, so it feels fitting to share these remarks here. I also would like to thank our funders. So digital programming at the RMG is generously supported by the Durham Community Foundation. I would like to thank our core funders, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, and the City of Oshawa. Without them, none of our programming would be possible. And of course, our incredible partner for this exhibition, the Scotiabank CONTACT Photography Festival, which has amazing online programming and public art installations about photography, featuring photography throughout the month of May. And before I introduce Christina and share a bit about why I adore her practice, I just wanted to share with you that the format of tonight's talk is going to be Christina and I chatting in conversation for about 40 minutes. We're going to talk through some of the series that have built up to the album, that are in relation to the album, and share some of her work in progress, which is really exciting to see. And then we're going to turn it over to you for questions. So the chat is ready for questions as they're arising throughout the talk, but we'll probably still hold them till the end. You can also use the Q&A feature. And if anyone wants to jump in at the end and actually ask a question to Christina directly, we'll be able to do that as well. And again, any tech issues, just reach out to Ingrid in the chat. All right, so Christina Leslie is an artist who's based in Pickering, Ontario. She earned her BFA in 2006 at Oakhead University in Toronto and is presently pursuing her MFA at the Savannah College of Art and Design in Georgia, USA. I hear there may be some faculty tuning in, so hello if you're here. Leslie was a speaker at the SPE conference in Philadelphia in 2010 and a panelist for the Position as Desired Symposium at the ROM in 2011. Her photographs have been featured in numerous publications, including most recently in the UK magazine Murs. Her latest series, Morant Bay, many of you may know because it was a featured exhibition in the Contact Festival last year. And 3 prints from that series were transformed into billboards as part of Vancouver's Capture Festival last year as well. In the fall of last year, in 2020, Leslie was part of When Night Started at Sea, Contemporary Caribbean Art at PAMA in Brampton. And she will be featured in the upcoming exhibition, Movers and Makers at Prefix ICA in Toronto. Much of her photographic practice revolves around themes of identity, immigration, issues of marginalization, memory, race, and her West Indian heritage. She often utilizes text and photo collage in her work, as well as historical photographic processes. The thing, Christina, that I really love about your practice is how you approach making work through this process where you're just endlessly curious and so willing to experiment and try new things. You have such a firm understanding of the power of photography as a narrative tool, and I really love that you are able to approach making work with both this hunger for knowledge and truth seeking, but also a real freedom in how you're thinking about making and how you think about producing work. You are super tactile and process driven in how you think a lot in your work, which when I first experienced your work wasn't always immediately apparent, like the depths of how much that process is important to you. And I think there's such a richness and depth that brings to your work and such a thoughtfulness to your practice, and offers this really deep and layered meaning. So I'm really excited to talk more with you about some of these bodies of work and to dig a bit deeper into how you go about making it and how you think about photography and how you think about your practice. So before we start and share some of the images, I wanted us to start from the beginning. And I wanted to ask you if you could share a bit about when you started to make art, or when you turned to art as a tool for your sort of expression and exploration, and when you found photography in that as well.
Well, I think I've always kind of been a creative person since I was like a child. I used to draw and sketch, and I was kind of crafty. And I think it continued on in that vein within high school. And I was always selecting, like, you have to choose elective courses. They were always around visual arts. And so, well, with photography in particular, my teacher at the time, Mrs. Roach, she had said, I think you would be really good uh, at photography, and I think it would really lend itself well to just kind of your creative outlook. And so I said, okay. And so she presented like this darkroom class, and I went and I tried it out, and I really liked it, and I just kind of ran with it. I never looked back, and then I pursued it further in university for my undergrad, and then again now while I'm pursuing my master's.
Yeah. So in our conversations before this talk, it felt really important as we were looking at the album series, which is quite a concise body of work. It's a smaller series that we wanted to talk through some of your other bodies of work and sort of think about how they're in relation to the album and how they can help us to sort of think about the wider sort of themes and arcs and ideas that you're dealing with in your practice. I shared with you, and I think a lot about your work that, or your practice, that I think of it like chapters in a book. Your series, you're kind of coming back and drawing on the same themes. You're thinking through the same ideas anew, sometimes years later and years again. And you're constantly working through and evolving your thoughts around themes of how you're dealing with your family, of how you're thinking through identity. And so I wanted us to begin. I'm going to just share screen now. So what I wanted to do to begin was to talk through a series that you made called Everything I Re in 2006, or sorry, yeah, in 2006 as part of your undergrad degree at OCAD. And I'm hoping that we can start here. This was the first body of work of yours that incorporated your family but it's also really process driven. So can you tell us a bit about this work, and why it was significant for you to document your friends and your family in this way?
Okay, so I feel like this work, everyone always comes back to this one. It seem like it resonates like with everybody universally. But at the time I made it, it was my thesis year at OCAD, and I kind of had two mindsets. The first one, I was thinking about just like the overall like past 4 years of my undergrad, and I really kind of felt like there was a lack of visual representation from artists of color. I felt like a lot of the artists that they had referenced at the time were more centered around um, white narratives, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I just felt like there was too much of a gap, and I thought, well, how could I add to the larger discourse of photography? So that was one thought. But then the second thought had me thinking about my family and my father in particular. My parents have always had a really strong network of friends and family, and all throughout my childhood, I always, we had all these extended families and gatherings. But what was interesting to me is when my father was around, his extended Jamaican family and friends, instantaneously they're speaking in patois, which, for those who aren't of West Indian background, it's like broken English, like a dialect. And I always was fascinated with the stories that they would tell. Like there's something like really magical about it, and this passing of oral traditions and histories. So I thought, well, how can I merge these two ideas of making a body of work that spoke about a lack of representation, but then also added a West Indian perspective to that wider narrative? And so that's kind of um, where like the motivation came from to create the work.
Amazing. And do you want to talk both sort of about the process of making this work with your family and also the actual process of producing it for you?
Sure. So this was not produced digitally at all. I did everything in the color darkroom. So I mean last year was really like it was super labor intensive. Like I came up with this methodology of how I was going to create this work because I was really inspired by like Jamaican records and like ska posters and this idea of identity through passports. So what I did was I interviewed and photographed 14 um, people who were like either friends or relatives, and I photographed them on my Mamiya 645 camera, and it was like this I guess like it was on black and white film. And then at the same time I was interviewing them and asking them questions about their experience,
Mm.
like migrating to Canada, memories of back home. And then I would transcribe their interviews, and I would write them out in patois, but I used Miss Lou Bennett. She's a famous Jamaican folklore writer, and I used her as a reference to write it out in patois. And so then I went to Staples and I got like 20 by 24 acetate paper, and I got sticky letters, and I painstakingly every day like put these letters on this acetate. And then I took the black and white negative and brought it into the color darkroom. And through this masking and layering process, I figured out how to expose certain parts of the image and cover up others so that I could get like that greenish and yellow tinge behind them. I kind of dialed in a combination of cyan and magenta because I know cyan and yellow because I know that gives you green. And then I did a combination of like magenta and yellow to give you the brown sepia tone. And then I would cover that back up, and then I would expose the letter part with my Nokia flip phone that showed you how old I am. And I would just, because I know like color photography is very light sensitive. So white light would expose it and give me that kind of red. So I was playing with this color palette because it was significant to Jamaican culture of the Rastafarian colors or the Pan African colors of red, yellow, and green, and then black. So One photograph would take me about 15 minutes in the color dark room. And I'm doing this all in the dark. So I know on TV, we see photography in the dark room. We think of it as black and white and having that red safe light on. In color photography in the dark room, you can't have any lights on. So I'm literally going like this, trying to put it all together. And yeah, it literally took me the whole school year to come up with this process, and it's lived on like past 2006. It's traveled to so many different countries. It's been to Prague, which was interesting. It was featured at the Gamma U there, and I was really worried, like, how are these people going to understand, like they were translating the text into Czech, and I was
Mm,
like, well, how are they going to relate to it? But the feedback had been that the stories that everyone is telling in like the text, it's universal. Everyone can relate to like leaving home and moving, or going somewhere else. And I think memory is something that's so important to me. Like I'm constantly revisiting it. And so I created, yeah, this whole series, and it just keeps, everybody just keeps coming back to it. So I think this was like the first time I really felt like it made a body of work that I was really proud of, and
mhm,
it kind of just set me in the trajectory, like later now.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, and figuring out so early that storytelling and how deeply it resonates, how deeply this way of working resonates. Yeah. Um, I'm wondering, I mean, we've talked about this at length, but um, can you talk a bit about more why that tactile process or that really labor intensive work, and why these more analog processes, why you're drawn to them, and I know that you think really deeply about the history of photography and how that informs your work or how you're reacting with it or against it. So yeah, can you talk a bit about more what that tactile process means for you in creating these works?
I mean, I suppose I could make things a lot easier for myself. I think this is a life lesson. I make everything harder for myself, but I feel, for me, I feel most like myself when I'm producing things by hand. Like, and there's something to me about like being able to like look at the, like how everything influences each other, and the materiality, and producing things with your hands. It just makes me feel like I can express myself better, because research also informs my work. So
Mhm.
when I'm adding the research and the experimentation and the exploration, I feel like I've really accomplished a body of work, more so than if I just kind of just shot something straight on. And there's nothing wrong with working that way, but for me, I feel more like, I guess, an artist
Mhm.
when I do these things.
Mhm. Mhm. So I want us to move on to a newer series that you've created called Mixed Child. Um, this it's nice to see because it's a bit of a different approach for how you're looking at storytelling and portraiture. And this time it's with family photographs, but they're of you as a child. Um, so I will flip through them, but can you tell us a bit about what's happening in these images?
Um, so I think between like the end of 2018 to present, I think what is like driving my interest is kind of the reappropriation of your own archives of images, and
Mhm.
recontextualizing them and reframing them. And which isn't unlike the history of photography. We know Richard Prince, he talks about how he doesn't need to take new photographs because he can art we're already filled in a world of imagery where he can just repurpose them and make new works. So I I think that's kind of where I was thinking about this work. But what was happening visually is in 1987, um, through my daycare, there was this young woman, I guess she was doing her practicum and trying to obtain her ECE degree. And she decided to use me as like, centered her thesis around me as her subject. And her, I guess she was trying to see what children who are biracial and mixed race, if they answer, or what's the word I'm looking for? If they develop socially different than their peers, or mentally or psychologically. And so my mom was presented this like her whole paper in 1987. I guess she didn't have a typewriter or a computer. She wrote out her paper, and so my parents had this photocopy of it. And I was reading and I thought, this is so odd. Number one, to be the subject of a study centered around race to a degree. Um, but then it's not unlike what we know the history of how we view race. You know, they used to perform these like IQ tests. And so on like white children versus black children. So to me, it's like, okay, now I'm kind of also being put in that conversation, if that makes sense. So I was trying to be cheeky by finding photos that kind of matched her text. And it kind of went with what she was talking about. And it was also weird just to see like how she describes me. Very much like a subject. Christina is sitting on the floor. Her hands are perched. Her hands are in her lap. She giggles. When she eats, this happens. When she's interacting with these her fellow peers, this is what happens. And I get the idea that I was pretty precocious and I had an active imagination, not unlike how I am now. But it was just interesting. So, and then I framed it under this idea of calling myself the mixed child, as if I was like a subject. And so I think it's the first time I've really inserted myself and spoke about my own perception of identity being biracial, because it's not something I've ever really talked about. I have a lot of thoughts that I've kind of kept to myself, but I've never actually been able to express it. But I thought this would be a great opportunity to do it. And so I think this is something I still want to revisit and maybe come back to. But it was interesting to try to match to like photos that match the story.
Yeah. And such a strange document of part of your childhood from such a strange perspective. And I mean, this is such a powerful work about identity and about, I mean, there's such a powerful recast and reframe that I think you're able to do in this work. And sort of point to the absurdity and sort of what is happening with those documents. Yeah, and can you talk a bit about more like some of what that meant for you in this way of looking back and sort of reframing this document for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a reclamation of me coming to terms with how I perceive myself as a biracial person. And I've never, again, like I said, I've never actually talked about it. But when I think about, um, years growing up, I would hear like the most, like really derogatory terms to describe yourself as a mixed person, like half breed, like that. I mean, it's, and that was something I would say because other people would call me these terms and then I would inscribe it upon myself. So I think, and now realizing like how problematic that term was and not fully understanding even the history behind that term. And just hearing like really stupid things like, oh, you don't look like your typical mixed girl. Like, what does that really mean? And so I think like by me reframing the work and kind of being kind of cheeky and it's slightly satirical, it's me reclaiming my identity and repurposing who I think I am and being assertive and sure of myself, where I don't think I always was when I was younger, but now thinking about race and identity, I feel fully realized, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. We also had wanted to touch briefly on your beautiful series, Morant Bay. We know you had a longer artist talk about this body of work last year as part of last year's Contact Festival and your exhibition at Band. And so it still felt important as this work in sort of unpacking and understanding what's happening in the album series. And so yeah, these stunning images were taken on a trip that you took to Jamaica, where your father was born. And from our earlier conversations, it sounds like there was just this real pull for you to take images there. And so, yeah, maybe let's start there. What drove this series for you?
I think personal family histories are really important to me. Um, I think I'm driven by this sense of nostalgia, but um, like originally I had my parents were already in Jamaica and they were enjoying the trip and they had this idea like you should come and meet us
Mm-hmm.
towards the end of the trip. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of cool. Like I'll just go. I mean, I go to Jamaica very often,
Mm-hmm.
but I hadn't visited my dad's hometown in many years. Typically, I would kind of go to the other side of the island just because I had more friends and family who lived there. And and so my perception of Morant Bay was was totally different when after I went as an adult. I remember it as a child, but going back and revisiting his hometown and then visiting places and landmarks that he had talked about were so important to him. Um, that kind of became like the driving force. I went with the idea like, oh, I'm just going to photograph. I'll bring my camera and I'll
Mm-hmm.
photograph kind of like the larger landscape. I was really interested in some of the abandoned structures that were there, but then it became something deeper. And the history of Morant Bay is really important too, because this is the site of the Great Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. And so there's something kind of happening there about equality and if you know the history of that rebellion, Paul Bogo and wanting equality, this was like 30 years after slavery had been abolished. And yet, the farmers and in the area, they were looking for equality. And I won't go into a huge history. You can watch that artist talk just like before. But these are all kind of things I was thinking about, and I think I was trying to have like an honest exploration of the community. And I think it's important for people to know in the history of photography, the way the Black body or the Black subject has been framed has always been kind of around this anthropological study. There's always kind of like a supremacist narrative around it. And so, and when you think about the West Indies in particular, or and let's just say, let's use Jamaica, you you think of like this perception from like a tourist lens, like and that's really those images that you see are curated based on what they think you want to see based on a tourist. So you're not really getting to understand the actual culture of the place, the people. And so it was really important to me to kind of think about that in the essence of documentary photography. And Walker Evans and um, Robert Frank and Dorothy Lang. I mean, they were all early photographers doing documentary photography in black and white. And I thought it's really important for me to legitimize um, like black narratives and like West Indian narratives. So that's also what I was kind of working with when I was photographing the area. And like this is my grandfather's house.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't seen it since I was a child. So to go back and revisit these places meant like it was super sentimental for me as well.
There's a question that just came in. Is it by Poinciana Crescent?
Yes.
Someone knows. Derek knows. There we go. I'm wondering, when you were there, like bringing all these rolls of film and shooting and cameras and shooting, was there anything unexpected in that, or did it change the way that you were experiencing the place through this project, like through this project of documenting it for yourself?
Yeah, I think, when you're like a documentary photographer, your goal really is not to be obtrusive and like appropriate. You really want to come in and kind of be a fly on the wall without feeling like you're exploiting a group of people. So it was important for me to kind of talk to everyone and have her build a rapport. And as I was building rapport and making these connections to these individuals in the town, I felt like I was just kind of documenting their everyday lives. And for all the Jamaicans who would go back and visit, when you're staying in country as a child, that's what we call it, it's super boring. Like, because as a child, you can't appreciate the nuances of the place. You can't, I don't think you're a child. You want to just go, be entertained, but to revisit this place as an adult was so much better. I had so much more of an appreciation from where my dad comes from and my extended family.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
I think, yeah, and I think showing these 3 series really does set us up to sort of talk about what's happening in this work, to talk about the album. And I mean, I think this is a concise, but it's such a conceptually rich and satisfying series. And I guess before we get into it, when we first started talking about this work, you shared this quote by Jennifer Blessing, who's a photo curator and historian, that you said really influenced you or impacted how you were thinking about your practice and your process, and specifically about making this work. She said that every photograph becomes a memorial to the past. Maybe can you tell me a bit more about why this resonated so strongly with you, or what you're thinking about through that?
Yeah. So Jennifer Blessing, she did this like, I guess she was part of a larger panel at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And she was talking about the photograph kind of and I'm paraphrasing, being like a monument to somebody's past. And when you have this visual record of yourself, it kind of memorializes you. And so then it led me to just, and this is again where I say research really informs my practice. I can see quotes and watch something, and something will just give me something to kind of think about. And she was talking about like this whole idea about the album, well, not the album, but like just photographs and memory. And for anybody who's studied, and all my SCAD girls are in the room, I see them, we all know, like, Roland Barthes, who's like major photographic theorist and critical theory around photography. He talked about this idea of like when his mom passed away, he was in grief, very like grieving. And then he like Cat, yeah, she loves him. She like really loves him. Um, um, we talk about this all the time, but he talked about how he's after his mom passed away, he saw this image of her and it kind of hit him. It was like a pin, like a prick, and he calls that like the punctum. And then he says, photographs can be divided in 2 ways. The punctum where like you have a visceral reaction, and then studium where you can resonate with the image, but it doesn't hit you like how a punctum will. So he sees this image of his mother who's long gone, and I thought, well, that's crazy. Like his mother is gone, and now she's captured in like a 4x6 or 5x7, which kind of leads to Walter Benjamin talking about the aura
Mm-hmm.
of somebody. And so I thought, well, what happens when you don't have a visual record of yourself? And it led me to think about my parents in particular, which is what all that to say, which led me to create this work.
Mm-hmm.
So my father, having grown up in Jamaica, and my mom being born in Canada, and like my mom has this visual record of herself from infancy all the way up until now. She could get her picture taken, walk across the street to the Parkway Plaza at Victoria Park in Ellesmere, get her the roll of film developed, and voila, she now has this archive of her. Whereas my father had expressed something different. The local photo studio was in Kingston, which was quite like an hour drive. So
Mhm.
it made me think about the access to photography and what happens when there's no record of yourself. What happens to your very essence? And so um, it made me think of the photographs I have seen of my father. I think there's like maybe three or four, and they all seem to be taken from like the same day or around the same time because I feel like he's wearing the same outfit.
Mhm.
So I thought, well, maybe I should make a visual record of him. So I used like documents. He had like a Boy Scout membership card. So I used that. Like that would be a record of him. He had this like book where Jamaica had gained independence. And it talked about when Queen Elizabeth had come to Jamaica to visit. And, so I documented that. I documented the back of one of the photographs because that was the studio which was developed. And then I had thought about like a placeholder. And I mean, I probably could have done this. Like this is all collage. Again, I'm making things harder for myself. I probably could have just laid a book out and put the pictures on it and just photographed the book, but I photographed every single picture, and I tried to find pictures that were indicative of the year. And then I thought about my mom. And what's interesting about my parents, they're both born in the same year. They're both born in 1950. They're a month apart. And just her upbringing and her family structure and having all these memories that she can revisit and speak about. And
Mhm.
then how these two people come together um, and form this relationship, and where they're from two very different cultures, but they're able to bridge, um, they're able to bridge together through this like marriage. Um, and I think that was kind of like what was the driving force. And being biracial again, um, I think interracial relationships probably in the early 70s weren't as common, not taboo, but just not as common as they are now. And so, having talked to other people who are mixed, they didn't have the same experience as I always did. My family, I guess I could have experienced like families where they didn't like support each other, where like one family didn't agree with this relationship, but that wasn't the case. And so I think it's just interesting how my mom really fit in with my dad's family. My dad fit in with her family. And this, I never experienced like any kind of like backlash for being biracial. My
Mm.
family was always super, super supportive. So I think that's why like it was really important for me to speak about and talk about. Um, and
Mhm.
like the album itself, we don't like we don't take pictures the way we used to. I think your phone has become like the new photographic album, and only you really have access to it. Like before, we would actually open up an album and we revisit memories and we talk about the pictures, like who's that, and oh, do you remember what happened this date? And like now we've like there's something about family around a photo, like a photo album. And
Mhm.
now we're not really doing that because it's like only you have access to those pictures, and they're usually often curated probably with more selfies than experiences, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
so I think that was really important to me to speak about preservation and the preservation of memory. And going back, and I chose an album that literally has no more acetate on it anymore. Like the tackiness is gone. And so I was trying to make it about like monumental and going back to this quote.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's that captured so many of the things that I was hoping we would talk about with this, and I'm curious. Um, it's this is such a beautiful work, and it's in some ways a really lovely portrait of your parents, but it's also in some ways a portrait of you. Um, and this sort of it's interesting the way that storytelling goes backwards and forwards. There's something future oriented, I think, about this work too, um, about this page that's needing to be filled. Um, does does any of that land for you?
Yeah, I mean, I left the last page because I thought, naturally, probably you would see the progression in this relationship because I ended it at them being married.
Mhm.
But like, I thought, well, then naturally the progression would be like the birth of myself and my brother, and then just all our continuous milestones. And I think in the family, I'm the one who takes all these photographs, and I do still print out pictures, and I do a lot of gifts around them.
Mhm.
Um, and there's something really special. So I thought it would be like a be continued, like to be continued. Like, and what happens next? Am I going to fill the album with images, or am I just going to leave it blank and your memory stops there because
Mhm.
there's no more sharing? So I think there's this duality I'm playing with,
Mhm.
um, of should I fill the pages so that we can reminisce later, or do I stop because of the new era of photography and how it's most of the images are centered around ourselves and only experiencing them ourselves.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, so before we turn this over to questions, I'm so excited about this. I love that that we're going to share a few images um, that you're working on, tentatively titled Black Anthology. Um, and I think rather than focusing on some of the personal histories, although they're woven into this is more of a zoomed out look at much larger sort of global histories and larger time scales. Um, and similar to what I was saying earlier, that I see your practice as being these chapters that are feeding into it. You've literally sort of built that into the structure of how you're thinking through this project that has different, it is an anthology. There's different chapters that are going into this body of work. Um, so uh, yeah, I'm wondering if you want to share a bit about the structure of this work, how you're approaching it, how you're working with models or subjects, sorry, and sort of what's happening with this new series.
So, like this is currently like I appreciate the fact that you wanted me to show a work in progress. So I'm actually kind of working on this right now for my MFA, and I just envisioned this doing a project around the idea of Black legacy
Mhm.
and narratives and this retelling of our histories, like what our history might have been like prior to enslavement.
Mhm.
And you know, unless you're really like looking for that information yourself, you're not told much. I mean, we know about the empires of Kush, and you're having to like really find that information yourself. So I kind of wanted to do a project where I was speaking about that and then adding chapters to the larger anthology of the Black diaspora history.
Mhm.
So it's like this celebration of what our identity might have been like had we not been enslaved, or even just prior to enslavement, and then how it continues on through Middle Passage, and then eventually I'm hoping it will speak about like a new reframing of identity and the hybridity of taking on various parts of our culture, like um and so yeah, and like this is like when I say this work is really fresh, it's really fresh. But I guess it's important to talk about the trajectory and where you're going and where you see your practice going. Um, mhm.
Amazing. Um, should we, can we talk a bit about sugar in this work
Yeah.
and food?
So I mean, like, um, and I have to say this. So like, you've also been a really inspirational person in helping me work through this idea too. So
Thank
I think
you.
it's fitting that you've kind of also been in active dialogue about what I've been thinking about, and I think that's so important to not just have you as a curator, but you're also still speaking about new stuff and what I'm working on. So while I won't give away the process, this is a body of work where I'm thinking about the geopolitics of food and what that looks like. And not to sound cheeky, but I'm thinking about like the sugar industry. It's so sweet, but the history behind it is so sour. And so this is kind of where like I'm thinking now, and I've been creating these images. They are out of sugar. It's not done digitally. And they're almost kind of sculptural in a way. And so I've been kind of mirroring these images with sugar and talking about the nuances of like, and discovering like, well, what is she trying to talk about with these images of like, a man being bound and then sugar on top of it. And I mean, I'm still working through it, so I can't fully speak about it yet because I'm still like talking about it, but
But I love the tactility of the work, and I love the experimentation that you're doing with your process and how you're moving in these sculpture directions. I think it's really exciting, and I'm really I'm so excited to see where these new bodies of work are going.
I mean, I think this is kind of like, it's almost like a circular pattern, like I'm coming back to full circle because my first thesis work was really about hand and the tactility and working with materiality and process. And now I'm like revisiting that same idea in this work. So it's kind of like, oh, I'm going back to this way of working again. And because I think I kind of left it a little bit, but I'm revisiting this whole idea of process and experimentation, which is so important to me in my practice. So yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing work in progress. I know it's a brave thing to do, and I love it. I think it's lovely. Anything else that we want to talk about before we turn it over to invite people in for Q&A? I see there's lots of questions and praise in the chat coming in, and a few questions already showing up in the Q&A. Anything else, Christina, before we turn it over?
I think I've covered everything.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Too. Okay, so I'm gonna invite Ingrid back in. And we already have a couple Q&A questions coming in, but just welcome anyone else to keep the questions coming. Ingrid, anything on your end?
Yes, so we have, as Leila said, a lot of really wonderful comments for Christina to check out in the chat, but there are already a few questions in the Q&A. So we'll start with, hi Christina from Paul Leslie. With the Irie series, what year did you complete it? And looking back, would you have done anything differently with that body of work?
Hi, Paul. That's my brother. I finished it in 2006, and I don't think I would have changed it. I feel like it's fully realized and fully formed. I know some people said you should go back and interview more people and keep adding to it, but and resolved. So no, and I wouldn't change anything. I think it's lived its own life of its own. It's had its own breath,
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That we do have, I don't want to miss a couple of questions that did come up in the chat. So we have one here. What do you hope to accomplish with your art, or what do you want people to take away? So I guess more generally.
I think racial equality has been something that's been really important. I know we're in an era where like now we're having like these talks about anti-Black racism and being really self-aware of marginalized voices, but I think it's something that's always been important to me. So if I can add to the larger like framework, I will keep doing that. And I strive to do that visually. But I think again, I just want to keep adding to that narrative and adding to the whole landscape of contemporary photography and being another artist of color who can contribute to that. So I'm hoping when people leave, they feel heard, especially if you felt like there was a lack of representation on your part and seeing yourself reflected in gallery spaces or art institution. I hope like you see yourself in my work and you can like you resonate. Because I think personal histories and personal stories are so important, especially among the Black diaspora.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Christina. Okay, a few more questions popping up here. What does your family think of this fascinating project? Is there a difference in the reactions you're getting from Canadian family versus Jamaican family members? Very interesting question.
I think my family, like on both sides, has always been incredibly supportive. I like they've never like both my brothers. I mean, my younger brother has let me put face paint on him and do a whole series around identity around him. My other brother Paul has been super supportive, and they both always come to my shows, and all my extended family, and they're just I feel so blessed to have the network of people I do around me, and and I feel real emotional. They've never let me down. They've always been okay. I don't see them having a difference, other than I think the Morant Bay was the one where my extended family who are from that area too, they could appreciate it and relate to it a bit more because they're from that place. But um they're equally just been so supportive of me.
I love hearing this. So nice. I saw your parents said hi in the chat earlier too.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions that are academic or related to your educational plans. So someone is asking what your plans are post MFA.
I have to finish the MFA. It feels so far off. I mean, I was like, oh, I think it'd be really cool to be like eventually go into curating or like writing critically about other artists. I mean, I have no idea. I just know that it's something I really wanted to complete. It's been a passion of mine, and would I still like to be like a practicing artist? Sure, but can I lend myself to other artists, emerging artists who are coming up? I somehow, if I could find a career doing that too, I think that would be really awesome.
You would be amazing at that.
And also related to your academic work. So part of your degree involves looking at academic and philosophical theory and applying it to your practice of photography. So this person is asking how this has reframed the way that you view your own work. Great question.
How has this been? I guess I just wanted to see, like, in terms of critical theory, like, how does my initial art practice fit within that? Like, I'm talking about like Roland Barthes and how that influences my work. And can I create bodies of work where all that theory is still moving forward, and I'm creating work that interjects and inserts these theories. So I think for me, that's how it's reframing it, because it's what's driving me and motivating me to create these bodies of work, because it's influencing in how I look at photography. And even how I also critique other artists, because I think I have like all this stuff in here and all these readings, and I'm like, okay, how can I speak about this to somebody else's work as well and contribute to like a larger conversation or dialogue?
Mm.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a few more questions here in the Q&A from Melissa. Hi, Christina. Would you ever bring back your satirical pieces regarding race? It was at the Gladstone.
Well, of course, I feel like that work it's really controversial. A lot of people really didn't understand it. She's talking about this series called Misperceived, in which I was playing with the history of blackface and minstrel shows. And now I think it would really work well with just the political and social climate we're in. I don't know. I thought about trying to bring it back and put it back into circulation, because I worked really hard on that one as well. So, um, maybe it's something I think about, or maybe trying to reframe it, even in this next chapter of my thesis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And uh, I guess a more personal question, but is anyone artistic in your family? So are there any other artists in your family?
My brother Michael is an amazing artist. Like he like can draw anything, and I just don't think he thinks he's as good as like I see him. Like he's amazing. And I think like my parents, like they're really good at doodling. They have really amazing doodles, like But I think, and my cousin Nicole, she's a really incredible artist herself, and so I think there's something there in the water.
Nice. There's a good one that came in through the chat too, that have you warmed up to, I know the answer to this question, but have you warmed up to digital, or are you still committed to film? But maybe, yeah, maybe talk more about how you flip between digital and analog, or when you're thinking about them.
Yeah, so I always think about, okay, how can I visually express this idea? What would be the best format? So I think before I commit to like one or the other, I try both. And if one is working, like if I can communicate my idea better visually through film, I will, or through a pinhole camera, I will, or if I can do it digitally, I will. So it just depends on like concept and how it's going to drive the conversation, and will it add to it. You should always think about that when you're making work, like how can you best express it in what form. So I kind of toggle between both.
Mm-hmm.
We've got another comment and question in the chat from LD. So saying that you're a new discovery for me, and as a person of color, this definitely resonates. Very important to have representation and a different narrative presented. And a couple of questions to follow. So do you experience resistance in what you want to present? And where do you get your strength and clarity of message from?
I mean, I've had combative conversations around my work, and some people not always agreeing on like where I'm going to go with it. But I think if I want to be true and authentic to myself, I have to just keep pushing and plowing forward. Um, I think again, like that misperceived series, the one that was at the Gladstone, that one was it was really heavy, and I know the what I presented was really heavy. And I was interviewed by Matt Galloway on CBC, and he really even didn't know how to speak about the work because for him it was too like much. But I was like, that's okay, because I mean I'm I'm having conversations that maybe people wouldn't normally have, and so I think that's kind of also where I gain my strength and clarity, is like remembering conversations and how it propels me to move forward. Um, I'm not really scared to be tongue in cheek anymore. That's over for me. Like when I was first starting off my career, now it's more about I have to be true to my own vision. I mean, and I center myself around people who critique my work, knowing my practice and being able to push me to do better. I've never had somebody critique it and be like, this is awful. Actually, one time, but it made me do better, like, because they knew I was capable of more. But yeah, I hope that answered your question. I was kind of going on a tangent there. I apologize.
So we still have some time for a few more questions. If anyone wants to pop those in the chat or in the Q&A, or if you wanted to share any additional comments, please feel free to put those in the chat as well. So we'll just give everyone a couple of minutes here.
Christina, there was something we didn't talk about, which is with your new work, and I mean, in other series that you've worked on that we didn't show, you are working with collaborators, or we didn't speak about it as much, about what that process is like for you when you're photographing people in this narrative way. You're sort of staging a scene, and what that process is like of working. Well, they're often friends, of bringing your friends into your work.
I think, well, one, I think my friends who have followed me for years, they're like, and I see some of you here. I love you guys. You guys are been like just really instrumental to my growth and super supportive. So I thank you all. But my friends, I mean, maybe they don't get to verbalize how they feel, but I feel like by them being active participants in the series, their voices are still being heard, because obviously they're agreeing to be in it, because I think they also agree with what I'm talking about. So I think I'm lending a voice to them, even though they might not be saying it, because of the things that are of concern to me. And so I think that's kind of like where the collaboration is a bit. I mean, recently I had my two friends, Melissa and Ronaldo, and sorry, three friends, and Andre and Stephanie. I was interviewing them about like for another body of work, and just the conversations that were coming up during the video. And they were saying, we never get to really talk about these things. You're creating kind of spaces for us to communicate, all that we're thinking. And I think, and if I can just really quickly touch on this, I think Black trauma is very real. And I say this because we're so used to seeing images of police brutality and oppression. So when you have images that are trying to counteract that narrative and bring a new perspective, and if you can yourself add to that larger conversation, I think I've done my job. And by them participating in it, they're also allowing themselves to be inserted in that conversation as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's it's powerful storytelling that you're doing through your work.
Okay, we've got a few more questions coming up in the Q&A in the chat. So do you feel that you have to hold back while doing any kind of work that involves race with regards to the current political scene facing the world right now?
No, I think now is the time to do it. Like, I think if it's out there now, so why not just talk about it? And I think if you yourself as a viewer are having some kind of resistance to it, what is that? What is that for you? My responsibility isn't to make you feel better when viewing the work. My responsibility is to make work. If you have a reaction to it, what is that saying for you as the viewer? So I don't feel like I need to shy away from anything. I think it's important, and if someone's going to do it, I want to do it. Amy Sherrill, really great painter, she said, I just wanted to create like artwork of Black people just being Black, because she never saw that. And so for her, it was important. And I think that's kind of like me. I just want to create work that creates conversations about inclusivity, and addressing some of these like really torrid histories that we have with each other.
Yeah, there's lots of questions coming in right now on this around politics and your work and how you're thinking about it. How do you find that your work and voice are heard in the artistic space in the US today with political climates? I mean, if it's the same question over again, but I think there's lots of interest coming in the chat of people asking these questions around politics in the States and your work, or politics in Canada and your work.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because, my school is in the States, and I think there is a different perspective in how we view race in Canada. I think we kind of shy away from talking about it here. We're like really polite people, like, oh, this stuff really doesn't happen, but these do happen. We know what's happened with the Indigenous population in the past. And so, while I'm not from that community, I still would feel that work needs to be talked needs to be displayed to have those conversations. But I think for me, when we think about, I guess, enslavement or racism, we look at it from an African American perspective, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's this whole other diaspora of people who experienced Middle Passage as well, and what that means. So I think if I can add to that conversation to think about how we all connect with this history, and even Canada's connection with, saltfish and producing the codfish that was fed to the slaves. I mean, that's something we don't actually, well, not a lot of people, it's not very common knowledge unless you decide you want to look out for it yourself. So if I can bring history also into the work and discussion, sure. I don't even know if I answered that question. I felt like I just went off.
You gave a beautiful answer though about your work. So thank you.
We have a question here about, I think referring to the Morant Bay series. So first, a comment that your series are all very compelling and concise. So how do you make decisions? How do you decide when a series is finished or when a work is finished? For example, the history of your father's bay, you may have taken a lot of photographs at that time.
When I don't have anything else to say, I feel like that's when it's complete. Like when I don't have any other ideas that can like make it stronger. With Morant Bay though in particular, I feel like that could be a lifelong project for me, because I think it's still about going back and revisiting not just Morant Bay, but the surrounding parish of St. Thomas, and like photographing Seaforth and Yalis, and going into Port Antonio, and for any of the Jamaicans in the room, they would know what I'm talking about. But like photographing like all the communities that make up Jamaica, and kind of doing a larger project about that, I think would be, if I had the money and the time off, I would do that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we can probably take a couple of more questions before we finish off. So if anyone wants to add anything to the chat or the Q&A, I'd love to ask a question in the meantime while we're waiting. I'm really curious about when you were talking about the Morant Bay series and sort of documentary practice. There's this sort of long history in documentary photography, as you mentioned, about people documenting from the outside. So what is it like for you, or sort of, can you speak a little bit more about the importance of telling a story about your community, or your people from your own perspective, rather than having somebody from the outside tell that story, and how might that change or shape the narrative of that story?
Yeah, I think you always have to be conscious of like photographing a community or a group of people that is not directly of consequence to you, because then it seems like you're appropriating culture, and you're appropriating like your own idea of what these images should look like and what these people should look like. But I think to be authentic would be to photograph, to go in and stick with, I shouldn't say stick. To photograph your community means there's still some there's authenticity there, because you can relate back to it and you're building a rapport. So I think it's really important to shy away from like appropriating something that you don't really have a firm connection to. And so I feel like it's okay for me to like photograph it, because I'm so like, my Jamaican heritage is, it's been really important part of my work. And so I think it's okay to keep adding stories about that history and those personal histories, because Canada itself, like there are a lot of West Indians here, especially in Toronto. So how can I keep making work about that they can also resonate too? And I think the Caribbean, as a Caribbean artist, or you don't get to see that as much. I mean, I know very few like Renee Cox and Ebony Patterson, but how can we keep adding more names to that roster of artists?
Mhm, mhm.
Thank you so much. Okay, we've got another question in the chat. Let me just so I guess, do you ever sort of feel placed in a box as a Black artist and a woman of Caribbean descent when you're in the US? And does your presence and vision challenge them as well as push you as an artist?
I think we have a habit of labeling art one or the other. It's either Black art or white art instead of it just being art. And so I think while I guess I'm talking about pushing Black narratives to the foreground, I would want there to be a time when we didn't look at it as just Black narratives, but just this universal experience of humanity. I think because I'm always returning back to themes of memory, um, family, history, everybody in the world can relate to that somehow. So if we can have conversations that they start becoming centered around that rather than, oh, you're a Black artist or you're this. I might be those things, but it's still important to still have to relate to each other on a humanitarian level. I don't know if I've answered that. That was a really good question, Mr. Proudfoot.
Sometimes very, very challenging to answer things on the fly, on the spot like that, for sure.
But I think that you are such a skilled and talented storyteller through your work, and you've figured that out so beautifully with your craft of how you're building narrative through images, through photography, if it's archival or found, like family histories, or the way that you're crafting images.
Right.
You carry those stories so beautifully through your work, and that's those stories are universal. Those narratives are universal as much as they're specific. They're yeah, it's so thoughtful in the way that you're able to do it. I feel like if we're winding down a bit we have one more question from your brother. So we can I think probably wrap up with that one, unless anyone wants to sneak one more in. But this has been so wonderful hearing about your work in more depth in this way. Ingrid, take it away.
Oh, we've got another one in the chat too.
Okay.
So your brother is saying, having seen all of your work over the years, do you find it challenging to feel inspired, or do you find inspiration everywhere? So for example, in people, places, themes, so where are you finding new inspiration for your work?
I mean, I think that I went through a little bit of like a period where I had like artistic block after the Misperceived series, and I think I had a really hard time like trying to reconnect and make new work. But I think I've gotten into the process of constantly reading and constantly looking at other artists' work and constantly being engaged in the visual arts and then anything really can inspire me at this point, because I've put myself in the framework to just be always on. I think sometimes I have so much happening up here and I just need to get it out. Whether it works or not, I just keep getting it out. And I think as I keep exploring things, I add on and I figure it out somehow. So anything can inspire me, really.
And are you ever, someone else is asking, have you ever become, or have we ever thought of, becoming involved in filmmaking? So the film industry, is there any inspiration there because you're such a storyteller?
Yep, Betty Julian of Prefix Photo. She's been saying, like Christina, I think you really should like really think about taking up that gauntlet and learning film and somehow being able to speak about, because film also really like inspires me. There's been so many films like I look at cinematically and like, oh, those are gorgeous. And I think that film is also really inspiring my current thesis work as well. So um, yeah, it's another skill I need to learn. Lila can teach me because she's really good at film. Mhm.
Yeah, I would look forward to seeing those. You're getting a lot of cheer. You're getting cheered on for it. So there's lots of votes of confidence for you to take up filmmaking.
Okay, we've got we do have a couple more questions in the Q&A now. So one person would like to know that they say they feel your focus on culture rather than race is profound. With that in mind, would you consider traveling and working with different cultures, such as those in Africa, for example? So taking your practice to other places.
Sure, if I can find a way where I'm not like appropriating and I'm not and I feel like I'm being true to the voices there. And provided that I had like the money, because I feel like that's like so much like art requires money. like so yeah, I think that'd be cool. I think collaborating with other artists is also a way of lending to that conversation. Artists who are also part of that from that region and that area, like just getting their thoughts and how they view things. So sure, anything is possible. Like,
And
Yeah.
always a tough question for any artist to answer. So you may not be able to choose, but what is your favorite piece that you've created is another question we just got. So your favorite body of work.
I mean, Irie was such a labor intensive work. And I feel like I put my blood, sweat, and tears in it. I can remember many nights going home on the subway, kind of just being spent and crying, being like, what am I doing? And so I think that body of work, I hold it really dear to my heart, especially because of what it means to everyone else who's viewed it. But there's something about what I'm doing with this new stuff with the sugar, like I feel like it might move up in terms of my favorite work. But I also think Misperceived, there was something interesting about it because it had a lot of performative elements to it. I mean, I know we didn't show it here, but I know a lot of people resonated, like Melissa had said and others. But I think those two really.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Christina, and thank you everyone for joining us and for your really thoughtful questions and your engagement in the chat. This, I feel like, has been a really big love-in on your practice, which it should be. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I want to just say thank you to everyone who took their time out to join the conversation, and to Leila and Ingrid and everybody at the RNG and to the Scotiabank CONTACT Festival. So yes, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.